Hey, welcome to Fathering Our Future. I'm Anthony Vandegrift, and I'm not the perfect dad, but every day, just like you, I am trying to be better. I've had men on this podcast to talk about things like autism and Down syndrome. Today, we are addressing ADHD, and I am joined by Ryan Wexelblatt. He's the founder of the ADHD Dude, and let me tell you, this conversation is so insightful. I was ignorant of ADHD, and I knew that going into it. But when he began to talk about ADHD, I realized that I am so ignorant, but I learned so much. There's a whole spectrum that's being discussed in this conversation. And let me tell you, if you have children with ADHD, this is going to be helpful to you. Even if you don't have children with ADHD, there's a little bit in here for you too. I want to break in real quick and let you know how much I appreciate you listening to the podcast. My prayer is that I can be a help and a blessing to you on your fatherhood journey. So if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, go ahead and subscribe. And if at any point you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me via email at fatheringourfuture@gmail.com. And if you want other good content, you can go to the website, check out the blog, and other free resources. Thank you again for listening. Be blessed. Do you remember when you became a dad and all of a sudden those New Balances just hit differently? There's something about fatherhood that impacts your wardrobe, and I'm happy to share that I can help you with that now. Fathering Our Future now has merch. We have sweatshirts and hats and other pieces of clothing that you will enjoy sporting as a father. Just go to fatheringourfuture.com, select merch, or click the link in the description of this episode and get you something that you will enjoy and be proud to wear as a dad. Dad, I want you to know I care about you and I am on your side. So I have a free gift for you. I've put together a 7-day devotional, extracted from my devotional, Following Our Father, to help you realign your identity as a dad to be the dad that God has called you to be and that your children need you to be. Simply click the link in the description below and get your free 7-day devotional. Well, Ryan, it is a joy to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for being with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I am very much looking forward to this conversation. I know that this is going to be insightful and it's going to be very beneficial, especially for parents who have children with ADHD. I think even for myself as a parent whose children do not have ADHD. Before we jump into that topic, though, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about you, your family, and what you do at the ADHD Dude.
Yeah. So I am a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in ADHD. I'm a former school social worker. I worked in special education schools, many students with ADHD. And I always say my most important job is I'm a father to a son with ADHD and learning disabilities. So I kind of live and breathe this even when I don't feel like it. My son's a young adult now, so, life has gotten easier as he's gotten older. But yeah, this has kind of been my path for a long time now. So, and ADHD Dude is a company. I have a YouTube channel, and our goal is to support families of kids with ADHD with evidence-informed information and practical information that they can use, and just be an inclusive community to people, regardless of their faith or whatever their background is, and really kind of holding on to what I call I don't know if I want to use the term traditional family values because that differs for everybody, but really making family, the center of this and not just making everything just focused on the child and their issues, but, because ADHD really is a condition that affects the whole family. So that's why I kind of put family at the center of everything here.
Gotcha. I think that's beautiful. And I think that's a very good approach because, family is at the center of everything. We're all different components of the family, but we are trying to build something beautiful as fathers. So I love that. I do want to ask, though, with your focus on ADHD, is that something that was motivated because of your son?
No, I kind of got into this right as I finished graduate school. My first job was working at a special education school for kids with behavior issues. Most of the students were diagnosed with ADHD. And I kind of fell into it from there, really.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So then how was that when you had your son and then I guess it's considered a diagnosis of ADHD when that's actually determined? How did that feel for you?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit. I adopted him actually as an older child through the foster system. So ADHD, I would say, was kind of the least of the concerns I was dealing with. I mean, his behavior was extremely challenging. So,
gotcha.
It was kind of par for the course. Like I just kind of looked at it as like, yeah, this is just part of the picture here. So Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very cool.
But I will
Very
say
cool.
that being said, what I teach is so much of what I learned from him the hard way.
Sure. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Well, it's definitely one thing to, go to college and get all the education formally and then to go out into the real world and then try to actually apply it. So the experience
Exactly.
component, I'm sure, is definitely a game changer. All right. So onto the topic of ADHD that I think is going to be helpful for parents today. Um, from my layman's perspective, when I think of ADHD, I just think of hyper and an inability to focus. Now,
Hmm.
I'm sure that that's maybe scratching the surface, maybe, but I want to ask you, since you specialize in this, what does it actually mean when a kid has ADHD?
Yeah. So the first thing I always want people to know is ADHD is a really misleading name. So ADHD stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Well, there's many kids with ADHD who are not hyper. So
Okay.
really what ADHD should be called is an executive function developmental delay. So meaning the part of the brain in your forehead, your frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, that is the part of your brain that controls what's called executive functions, which I describe as really the operating system for the brain. In somebody with ADHD, their frontal lobe is developing approximately 2 to 3 years behind other people their age. So while they chronologically, might be 8, their executive function skills are more of a 6 or 5 year old. Or if they're 17, they might be closer to, a 14 or 15-year old. So what does executive function mean? Well, it has to do, as you mentioned, with, your ability to sustain attention, or I should say regulate your attention. So ADHD is not difficulty paying attention. It's difficulty regulating your attention to things that are not difficult to you. The
Okay.
impulsivity can certainly be a part of it for many individuals. And then other parts of executive functioning have to do with cognitive flexibility. So how are we adaptable? How can we move on from something? Another one has to do with how we sense the passage of time. Another one has to do with what's called nonverbal working memory, or what I call future thinking skills. So your ability to visualize yourself doing something in the future. So what happens with ADHD is it has nothing to do with intelligence. It's not a mental health condition. It's actually called a neurodevelopmental disorder. So really
Okay.
your executive functioning is delayed.
So is there ever a point where ADHD kind of goes away? If so, my understanding is brain development can last up until about the age of 28 on average. So is there ever a point like into your 30s where this goes away, or how does that actually
Yeah.
play out?
Excuse me. So like everything else in life, ADHD is on a continuum, from mild to moderate to severe. And
Okay.
what we know is that the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to finish developing. It doesn't finish developing until you're about 26, 27. So somebody with ADHD, it's more like 29, 30. Now,
Okay.
does that mean that ADHD will magically disappear when somebody's brain is finished developing? No, but the idea is that wherever you're kind of at in terms of your executive functioning, when your brain is finished developing, that's where you will stay. Now, that being said, do many symptoms of ADHD improve with age and brain maturity? Yes. And to varying degrees, it lasts into adulthood for people. The good news is that we can, implement strategies to help build these skills, and teach somebody to work with their brain, rather than try to fight against it or just say, oh, well, there's nothing I can do. It's just my ADHD. So,
Okay. No, that's very interesting. This is all new to me. It's actually really fascinating. So let me ask a few just
mhm.
clarifying questions, things I think you've already addressed. So this is something that is developed from birth, not necessarily developed over time. Like you can't be 3 years old and then all of a sudden you get it. This is something that you're born with.
Yeah, so ADHD is one of the most heritable conditions there are, meaning there's a 70% chance it's passed down genetically. So that could
Okay.
be from the father, that could be from the mother, that could be from, an uncle. So it's highly heritable. So yes, somebody is born with ADHD. However, they might not start showing symptoms, until a later age. And often when we start seeing symptoms, particularly with somebody with more of what we would call an inattentive profile where the hyperactivity isn't there, often we see that start happening, when they get to school. Whereas with
Okay.
more, what's called combined type ADHD, which is the hyperactivity plus impulsivity, that tends to show itself earlier, or it's more noticeable
Okay.
earlier, I should say.
Okay. Let me ask you this then, because so the hyperactivity not necessarily being a part of ADHD for me is kind of mind blowing because that's the only way I've really
Right.
thought to even identify it. So then what is the what's the main difference, I guess, between ADHD and ADD?
Yeah. So we don't use the term ADD anymore, but what ADD
Okay,
used to refer to is the inattentive type. So just attention deficit disorder. We call
gotcha.
everything ADHD now, which is part of the reason why I say it's a misleading name. And then we
Ah,
categorize it by either, inattentive type, combined type, and then there's, just hyperactive only type. I've never in my entire career met a kid who's just hyper and impulsive yet can focus. So I don't
okay,
really believe that type exists, just because I've never seen it in my entire career, and this is all I do. Yeah.
got it. Okay. No, I appreciate the clarity there, and I think you mentioned this, but I just want to go ahead and ask it just for grins. Um, ADHD exists on a spectrum.
Yeah. I mean, I
Okay.
consider it that it does. Yeah, from mild to severe. Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. Great. Now, this was a timely thing that happened for me just yesterday. I was at the grocery store with my third daughter, or second daughter, third child, and there's a magazine, and right on the front, big bold letters, ADHD. And this whole thing was devoted to the differences in how ADHD affects females
Hmm.
contrasted to males. Now, I'm curious for parents who maybe they have sons, maybe they have daughters. What are some of those differences between boys and girls who have ADHD and how they're affected?
Yeah. So boys definitely tend to present more with the combined type ADHD more. So the, hyperactivity,
Yeah.
impulsivity combined with the inattentiveness. Whereas girls, they tend to present more with just the inattentiveness more. Also, what I always say is in school, we tend to leave you alone if you're not making any waves. So as a general rule, girls tend to get diagnosed much older than boys do because of
Okay.
this. Yeah.
Very
Because
interesting.
again, they're not exhibiting behavior issues. So yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the behavior issues and the traits. What are some things that parents look for that might indicate to them that their child should be tested for ADHD?
Yeah. So let me I think it would be helpful to clarify first. So there's actually no test for ADHD, just like there is no test
Okay.
for autism. The way we make an accurate ADHD diagnosis is by collecting data from people who see the child in natural environments. So that would be parents, teacher, if they go to daycare, if they're with grandparents, after school. So the more data we can collect, the more we can make an informed diagnosis. And like everything else, ADHD is a subjective diagnosis because there is no test for it. So it's really
Okay.
made from these behavioral observations. Okay. So that being said, typically what parents, how it comes to parents' attention often is, sometimes when, for particularly for more severe cases or for, the combined type, it will be, irritability, aggression, impulsivity. So those are kind of the most noticeable signs. For children with more inattentive profile, it often doesn't start to kind of come out until they're in school, often kindergarten, but sometimes it doesn't get noticed until first grade when they're required to sit at desk for long periods of time. So often it's educators bringing it to parents attention first, particularly
Okay.
with the inattentive type. Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. Now, what would you say to, because I am mostly in Christian circles, and I
Hmm.
know that within this Christian camp, there's clearly a spectrum of different beliefs, but there are some who are very anti-medication.
Hmm.
They reject a lot of diagnoses, whether it be ADHD or autism or whatever it might be. Um, can you speak to why it's so important for us to know whether or not our child has ADHD?
Yeah, because if you don't have context for understanding how your brain works, then that's a problem. So let's say a child does have ADHD, and the parents decide we don't want to label him. We're just going to kind of sweep this under the rug. Well, then the child's going to likely grow up thinking something is wrong with them and having no context
Mm,
for understanding how their brain works. And then how does that affect their self esteem? Right, when
yeah.
when they can't focus or they have difficulty with peer relationships, but again, they have no understanding of this whatsoever. So in my opinion, it really does kids a disservice. As for the medication issue, and I mean, we can get into this if you want, but one of the things I find with medication is, number one, I think I should start by mentioning this, that I have a saying that families tend to be unintentionally misled as soon as their child is diagnosed with ADHD. And here's what I mean by
Mm,
that. the professionals tend to not be very well educated on ADHD, which is always shocking to people when they think about how common ADHD is. But what typically happens? Let's say a pediatrician diagnoses a child. And they go through the proper channels to do that. What they typically do is say to a family, "Okay, go find a therapist, or find a play therapist, or find an occupational therapist." None of those things are evidence-based recommended treatments for children with ADHD from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Wow.
Or a lot of times pediatricians will say, "Well, she doesn't need medication, because she's doing fine in school." And my response to that is always, ADHD medications were not designed to be performance enhancing drugs. They're designed to help improve the quality of your life. And there are decades and decades of research data on ADHD medication supporting that not only are they safe and effective, but but somebody with ADHD who is medicated, it reduces their likelihood of developing a substance abuse problem later in life. And it reduces their likelihood of a whole myriad of problems, whether that's with employment, accidents, interpersonal relationships, all kinds of things. So often when I find people are, quote, anti-medication, I find that it's not coming. It's an uninformed opinion, really. It's not coming from anywhere factual. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think
I'm sorry. Can I just mention I just want to mention, in all fairness to parents, that the amount of misinformation and disinformation on online, particularly on parenting social media about ADHD, cannot be understated. It is extremely difficult for parents to discern what is factual evidence-based information from opinion. So yeah.
No, and I think that's the case kind of across the board with everything. Everyone's got an opinion about
Yes.
everything, and you know how it goes. So it's just like if you like one person and you trust them and they say this, you go with that, even though they might have no clue about this field of study.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's good to know, because I think what I have assessed so far is, as a parent, you have a child, and the expectation is that my child is going to be quote unquote normal, whatever I define as normal, which most times, if you really sit and think about it, what we define as normal probably has a little hiccups in it as well. But what we envision as normal, and then we get a diagnosis like ADHD, and we think, oh, the world's just going to fall apart. My child's never going to be able to do anything. This is so bad. What I have assessed so far is that having ADHD isn't a bad thing. It doesn't mean that, everything's going to fall apart, that this is, so problematic that it just can't be addressed. I mean, even in your case, one of the things that comes up a lot in conversations that I have with parents who have children with either autism or Down syndrome is, your kid's going to grow up, but they're always going to be dependent on you. This is not the case for a child with ADHD, correct? Like they're going to grow up and be independent and get out of the house.
They absolutely can. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, and then, again, to the medication thing, medication's not a bad alternative. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah.
I mean, informed.
Yeah. So what I'll tell you is the American Academy of Pediatrics, the evidence-based, meaning that it's supported by plenty of science and research data, the recommended treatment for children with ADHD under 6 is parent training first. That's what I provide, followed by the use of methylphenidate, which is, a stimulant if necessary. For children 6 and up, the recommendation is parent training in conjunction with medication management.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I want to get into that in just a second. I want to ask this real fast. You've said a lot about this, but maybe if there's anything that hasn't been brought up yet, here's a good opportunity. As far as what we typically get wrong, misunderstand about ADHD, maybe some common myths. Again, I know you've addressed a lot of this, but if there's any one thing that hasn't been brought up that you feel should be brought up, here's an opportunity.
I think one of the most important ones, particularly for fathers to hear, is that, I find that men tend to look at ADHD as a character flaw. So he's disrespectful, he's lazy, he's lying, these kind of things, and really we can attribute all these things to ADHD. And I always want to clarify, that I never use ADHD as an excuse. Rather, we use it as a description of how your brain works, but we still have to teach accountability, and we still have to teach skills. So I think that's the first one, is that it tends to be misinterpreted as a character flaw. I would say number 2 is that people think ADHD is difficulty paying, attention, or it's, willful defiance. That would probably be the second one, which again also can seem like a character flaw to somebody who's not informed about ADHD.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Which, depending on the parenting type, I mean, I think back to the old school days of, I've got stories from my father where he's like, yeah, he grew up with a single mother and she had 5 kids and raised another
Right.
one. And so whenever they were defiant, it was, all right, you go outside and you pick your own switch and we'll see what happens.
Right.
So, I mean, I could imagine that you have a child, if that's still your practice, and you're seeing these character flaws and you're seeing this defiance, if that is your approach to parenting, you're not doing any good for the child at that point. I mean,
Correct.
because it's not a character flaw. It's not that they're willfully being defiant.
Correct.
It's brain development. Correct.
Right. You cannot punish ADHD out of somebody.
Yeah.
Right. That being said, kids with ADHD absolutely need to experience natural consequences. That's really important for people with ADHD, but there's a difference between experiencing natural consequences and punishments, So you can't punish somebody into better executive functioning. You can't punish somebody into modifying their behavior. That's not how it happens. We do that through building skills. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And if that was super effective, we would probably still do it to adults in the workplace, which would be really awkward. And we don't. So, okay. Hey, if you're a new dad or choosing to embark on a fresh start as a father, I have a gift for you. I wrote a book a while back called Cut the Crap, Direct Tips for Becoming a Dad. I don't teach you how to change a diaper. That one's totally on you. But I do talk about 5 elements that you need to focus on as a dad if you want to be the dad your children need you to be. And this is completely free. It is yours. There's no strings attached. The only thing that I'd like you to consider is if the book brings value to you as a father, make a contribution by going to fatheringourfuture.com/support. But you don't have to. Again, it is a free gift from me to you. The link is in the description after the end of the episode. Click it, get your copy, and I pray that it helps you. Everyone has an opinion on fatherhood, but there's only one place that we should actually look, and that's to God, our Father. That's why I wrote Following Our Father, a devotional for dads. In this, I cover 30 qualities and attributes of our Father in heaven that help us better understand our identity as dads. Each devotional is followed up with a daily step so that we can take the principles of our Father and immediately apply them to our own lives. This is a tool and a resource in your hands that will bless you. Click the link in the description and get yourself a copy of Following Our Father today. Okay. All right, great. So let's get to some of these the parent-child training tactics that you were talked about, best practices to implement for parents who do have children with ADHD, best practices to implement in the home. What are some of those?
Yeah. So number one, I think maybe it would be helpful if I go through some of the things I teach, because everything I do is evidence informed. Yeah. Okay. So number one, in terms of, dealing with behavior, is we don't accommodate behavior. So when we talk about parental accommodation, what parental accommodation is when parents change their behavior to alleviate or avoid their child's temporary distress. So let me give you an example. Let's say that your child's going to have a big meltdown when you tell them to get off video games. Okay. Well, then you say, okay, well, I'll just give them a little more time because I don't want to deal with a tantrum right now. That's a form of accommodation. Or they're scared to sleep in their own bed, so you let them sleep in your bed. That's another form of accommodation. When we accommodate behaviors, they become worse over time. So that's one thing, is that we have to learn to not accommodate. And people have a lot of trouble with this word, because people tend to think of accommodations meaning useful accommodations, like things we do in school, right? There's a difference between helpful accommodations and unhelpful accommodations. And what we tend to see in families of kids with ADHD is that they just naturally fall into this pattern of unhelpful accommodations often. So that's one thing. The other thing we have to focus on is, skill building. So developing independent skills, learning not to feed into, what I call learned helplessness. So, because kids with ADHD have difficulty tolerating getting through non-preferred tasks, right? Because they have difficulty sustaining attention. So when you take over and do things for them, that's a form of accommodation. And what happens in that process is they don't develop skills, and they lack the independence of their similar age peers. So that's another thing, is we have to help build independent skills. Some other things that really big that is really talked about is what I call cultivating flexibility. So people with ADHD have a propensity to be inflexible. So we need to help them learn how to be more flexible, because that is really one of the most critical life skills of all. Because if you tend to be inflexible, you can't work in groups with people. It's going to impact your social relationships. So that's another big one as well.
Could you give an example of what you could do to help the flexibility?
Yeah. So, well, for one thing, to not accommodate inflexibility. So, I think this is a good analogy to use. A mother said to me once, the more flexible I was with my son, the more inflexible he became. And she used the example, if I made dinner and I put it in front of him and he said, "I'm not eating this," she would say, "Okay," and she would make him a completely different, dinner. So what not accommodating flexibility would look like, it would be to say, "Okay, well, here's your choice. You can have this, or I guess you can make a sandwich for yourself," even if they don't know how to do that themselves yet.
Yeah.
That would be an example of that. Another thing is helping them see things from different perspectives, so helping them understand just the way you think is not right and everybody else is wrong. People with ADHD tend to have this strong, sense of justice, where, they want fairness and they tend to think that they are always right. So we have to help them understand that, just your thoughts about something are not right and everybody else is wrong. And there's different ways to look at situations and different ways to approach things.
Okay. So what this sounds like to me for parents is, I want to say, I wanted to say that maybe this is an increase, but I don't know that this really is. I think this is something that for parents needs to be maxed out all the time. But it looks like this requires a lot of intentionality and maybe a little more patience.
Yes, both. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let me ask you this. And you alluded to this with the independence element here, but my wife actually brought this up because, I'm not that smart. So I usually check with my wife, who's real smart, and I say, "Hey, give me some better questions here." And she said you should ask about tips and tools that parents with children who have ADHD can help their kids with, so that they can grow up and be independent, successful adults. And she gave the example of, she listens a lot to John Deloney, so I guess he still refers to it as ADD with his particular case, I think. But his wife has a little thing that she says to him, "Don't forget to remember." And it's this little play on words. And this is his trick so that he doesn't, overdo it on gummy bear snacks or something like that.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that parents can do with their children that specifically gear them to be successful as they mature into adults?
Yeah. So one of the number one things that I suggest is help them feel useful, because the ADHD brain needs to feel useful. They need to feel productive. And so, for instance, they need to have responsibilities at home. They need to have expectations on them. So one of the things that I often talk about is what I call high giving, low expectations, which is a dynamic very common in families of kids with ADHD, where nothing is expected of the child except maybe academic performance. So what happens is parents do way too much. They, not intentionally, but they enable, overdependence on adults, and they tend to enable learned helplessness when the child acts like they can't do something. So they rescue them from doing the non-preferred task. That doesn't help build resiliency. So we have to help build resiliency. We have to help kids feel useful and give them a sense of purpose. So I'm really big on, one of the things I teach is that there needs to be daily expectations in place for earning the things they want. Or I'm sorry, I should say the expensive things you provide for them. So things like video games, or, whatever screen time is not an entitlement. It is something earned from meeting daily expectations. And what I teach is to break up daily expectations between helping around the house and behavior. And for behavior, that can fall under cooperation. That can fall under how family members should be treated. That could fall under, a myriad of things, just depending on, what that particular child, needs to, build skills with. But I think that would be my top one, is to help them feel useful and give them a sense of purpose. Because what I can tell you is, in families of kids with, where high giving, low expectations is the norm at home, we tend to see kids who act extremely immature and entitled at home, but they don't exhibit that behavior anywhere else.
So let me practically break this down. Maybe within the home, if they need to feel useful, is something like a chore chart a good idea for them? Is the visual accompaniment something that is beneficial for them, or is this Does it just need to be a verbal exchange? How can parents enhance that with the instilling usefulness within the home?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Ironically, I don't suggest chore charts because lists
Okay.
tend to not work for kids with ADHD, although they are
Okay.
one of the main strategies that ADHD coaches and professionals recommend. Lists, checklists tend to not work because they're not visual, so they don't activate your nonverbal working memory or future thinking skills. So what I actually suggest is showing, having what I call a visual timeline of the child actually doing like their morning routine, or doing their afternoon chores, whatever it is. So they see themselves actually doing the task rather than just reading a list. A list can work for some kids for ADHD, but particularly younger ones, yeah, they just tend to not work for.
Okay. So this visual list that you're talking about, is this like I'm taking a picture of my kid brushing their teeth in the morning and I'm putting it on like a little timeline? What does that look like?
Yeah. So let's say, the morning timeline for upstairs is, you wake up, you brush your teeth, get dressed. So you would, do basically a sequence of pictures of them going through their morning routine upstairs. The idea with
Okay.
that is that when they can see themselves doing the task, that activates that nonverbal working memory, and it helps move from what I call prompt dependence, which is very common in families of kids with ADHD, which is, do this, put your shoes on, do that, to independence where they can actually use their own internal dialogue, their self-directed talk to say to themselves, okay, I did this. What do I have to do next? Well, instead of just sitting there waiting, I can go look at my visual timeline.
I see.
So
I
yeah,
see.
that's one of the things I teach.
So is the visual concept beneficial in the sense of it also shows them that they're capable of doing this? Like, look, you've done it before. This is what you do. Does that play into it at all?
I wouldn't say so much that, only because they know
Okay.
they can do it. But I think the way to describe this is, there's two types of memory. There's called verbal working memory, which is our doing a task, using the information we have to do the task, and nonverbal working memory, which is us visualizing ourselves doing the task. So I'll use this example real quick. If I know when I'm done talking to you, I have to go to the supermarket. I'm picturing myself driving to the supermarket, parking. I'm picturing what door I'm going to go in, what aisle I'm going to go in, go down to get milk. That's nonverbal working memory. When I get to the supermarket and do that, that's me using my verbal working memory. What happens with ADHD is it kind of splits nonverbal working memory from verbal working memory. That's why ADHD can also be called intention deficit disorder. You know what to do, but you might not, remember the sequence of steps to do it.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's actually,
That's
I'll give
interesting.
this analogy. It's a reason why if you say to a child with ADHD, clean your room, it doesn't happen. It's not because they're being defiant. It's that they can't visualize what the end result of that should be. Right.
I
So,
see.
so they understand what cleaning your room means, but they can't picture what it should look like. So it just, or the sequence of how it should happen. So it feels overwhelming for them. So like what I teach with that, for example, is, we break the room up into color coded zones. So like, let's say the bed is the yellow zone, your closet is the green zone. And we can put up pictures of what the end result should look like. So we can put up a picture of, this is your bed made, this is your closet organized. And we can say, match, make the green zone look like it's supposed to look.
Okay.
Instead of sitting there prompting them every step of the way, because again, that gets them to use their internal dialogue, which is something I didn't mention, but internal dialogue is basically us talking to ourselves. So people with ADHD tend to have inconsistent, they don't always hear their internal dialogue consistently.
Okay. Okay. That's interesting. I talk to myself all the time, so I guess that
Yeah,
kind of seals the deal for me.
right,
Okay.
exactly.
All right. So let me ask you this. Is there any this has been absolutely fantastic. Super super insightful. And I don't even have a child with ADHD. Is there anything else that you would say to parents who do have children with ADHD that you haven't addressed yet? I know we talked a little bit about the common myths and the character flaws, the willful defiance. Is there any last nugget that you would throw out to them?
Yeah, for many kids with ADHD, they struggle with similar age peer relationships. And that is because that's difficulty with what I call social executive function skills. So the executive function skills we use when we're sharing space with others. And some of those main ones, are perspective taking. So understanding others' thoughts and feelings and understanding how they're coming across to others. Sometimes parents think that their child lacks empathy. And what I explain is it's not a lack of empathy. It's difficulty with perspective taking, or it's difficulty with flexibility. And in terms of this social piece, I tend to find parents tend to skip over it because often people think, well, as long as they're doing fine, academically, then we can just let this go. But what we know is this, that your ability to form social relationships is the best predictor of future success. So what I would say is, if your child's struggling with this, please, check out my YouTube channel. I have a social skills playlist there. I create content for Attitude, which is the biggest ADHD resource in the country. And I've done plenty of free webinars that you can watch on social skills, particularly with boys. So just really don't just ignore this and hope it magically goes away, because that's what I do tend to find people do, is that they just hope this social issue will magically, get better. And then they eventually realize it's not getting better, in most cases. So, yeah.
I think it's very smart, kind of like what was brought up earlier, the element of intentionality, kind of across the spectrum of different areas that we have to deal with our kids. I always talk about, we are discipling our children, and discipleship often gets pinpointed to just faith and whether or not you pray to God. But discipleship is a huge umbrella that deals with every area of life. And so I think it's very important, like you talked about, to not ignore that social component, even with a child who has ADHD. Let me ask you one more question on the topic of ADHD, and this is for parents like myself whose children do not have ADHD. I think you've done a lot to clarify maybe some of the misconceptions, even that I had, that ADHD is just something that means a kid's hyper and maybe has bad behavior. And as parents, we do our best to try and protect our kids, if you will. We survey the landscape of children that we're going to allow our kids to play with and socialize with. And sometimes we say, well, probably not them, maybe this kid over here, maybe this family over here. What would you say to parents like myself when it comes to allowing our kids to socialize with children who have ADHD, and maybe not to be so leery of that?
Yeah. So what I would say is, there's research showing that when we educate other children, about ADHD, it actually is extremely helpful, both for the child who doesn't have ADHD and for the kids who do have ADHD. So, I think, one of the things with parents of ADHD is that they feel judged a lot, because, other parents see their child, yelling in public or having some kind of meltdown, and they think, oh, that parent's too permissive. So it's because, here's one of the things I always say is that when you have a child with autism, people can, autism tends to be much more noticeable than ADHD, right? So people tend to be, empathetic towards that parent and that child. When people see a child with ADHD struggling, they tend to not be very empathetic, because, they don't see any noticeable differences. So they tend to be much more judgmental of the child and of the parents as well. And what I would say is that, in my experience, most parents of kids with ADHD are doing the best they can at any given moment with the information and resources they have available to them, and really, to allow your child to, be around kids with ADHD, it's going to help them develop empathy for people with differences, number one. And it's also teaching them that, we shouldn't just judge people, right, based on their struggles, but we have to look at their heart also, right, and understand what's underneath there. And I think that's really the important thing.
No, I think you're right. I know even within my family, on my wife's side, we have a cousin for the children, and he has severe Down syndrome and autism. And they've asked, why is Stevie the way that he is? We've explained it to him, and with the understanding, they still interact with him, but in a way that Stevie could interact with them too.
Yes.
And so I think that's a great, insightful point, that, making sure that they understand that, okay, there's maybe a slight nuance here because they have what's called ADHD. And with that understanding, they can better relate, and then they can better empathize on their end and not be so judgy. And I think that's, that kind of struck a chord with me. I do my best to not judge, but I think it's very easy for us as parents to see a family with kids going absolutely insane and saying, oh man, something's wrong there. But it could be that there's something that we just don't see on the surface that is causing everything. And I think that's a good point, especially, speaking on this platform where it's predominantly Christian fathers listening. That's probably something that we needed to hear. So I'm glad that you shared that.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, if I can just add to that, I think the other thing too is just, I want people to understand that, most parents of kids with ADHD never get effective help. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. So not only are they struggling, in general, but they also haven't had good help throughout this as well.
Yeah. And that's super important for us to remember. Before we go throwing stones, we need to have a better understanding, a more collective knowledge. This has been fascinating. I have been enthralled throughout this interview. You were a wealth of knowledge on the topic
Thank
of
you.
ADHD. I appreciate the work that you do. I appreciate you taking time for this. I want to ask you my legacy question, and that is, in a general sense, what is your best piece of advice for dads?
So, for my answer for this, I want to go by one of the biggest or one of the most common concerns I hear from mothers, which is, my husband tends to, be emotionally reactive to particularly their sons, tends to be emotionally reactive and has difficulty, seeing this as, a, neurodevelopmental disorder, and he looks at it as a behavior problem. And I think, one of the number one piece of advice I would give to fathers is just be receptive to learning. Rather than just thinking that your opinion is right, be receptive to learning. And this is not a if you struggle with your relationship, particularly with your son who has ADHD, this is not a reflection of your parenting. Again, it's something you just have to educate yourself about, and that will help your relationship. But you have to be open to that.
I think that is such a good piece of advice for fathers. I know I've talked about it. You just so eloquently elaborated on that. And yes, yes, and yes. Our kids are growing up in a world that we don't fully understand. Just because we like to say we've been there, we've done that, we have the T-shirt, doesn't mean that we have the knowledge to help them today. And so, being open to learning continually through the process, and especially if there's something different in our children's life, such as ADHD,
Hmm.
you don't have it all figured out, you don't know everything. Be open to learning, be receptive to learning. So good. I want to give you an opportunity to tell people, I know you just mentioned it briefly, but if people want to learn more about what you teach on the topic of ADHD, how do they find you? Where can they go?
Yeah. So I have a YouTube channel called ADHD Dude, where it's hours and hours of free content. I have a dad talk playlist there, actually, specifically where I speak to fathers, and I'm starting to create more content for that. So that's my main source of free information is the YouTube channel, and then my website is ADHDdude.com.
Okay. Awesome. Ryan, this has been absolutely wonderful. And
Thank you.
I am so appreciative of your time. And maybe in the future we can do this again, because I still don't have it all figured out. But as I interact with more fathers who have children with ADHD, I might have some other questions to throw your way.
Absolutely.
So I'm grateful again for this. Thank you so much for being with me.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I told you at the beginning that this was an incredible conversation, and I don't have to tell you again because I know you're absolutely convinced that I didn't lie to you at the outset of this episode. So much of what Ryan had to say resonated with me, even not having children with ADHD. And if you do have kids with ADHD, I know that this has been a blessing to you. Please go check out some of his resources. You can go to ADHDdude.com. You can check out his YouTube page. Just look for ADHD Dude and you will find it. I'll also link this in the description to make it easy for you. But please take advantage of the resources that Ryan has made available, and his tip for dads in general, being receptive to learning. I just want to drive that home one more time. You don't have it all figured out. You might think you do at times. You might think, well, I've got the experience. I know this. I've got the answer. Your experience and your children's experience, they're going to be a little bit different. Be open to learning, especially if you do have a child with ADHD. It's not willful defiance. It's just developmental. And they need your help. They need your empathy, they need your wisdom, they need your intentionality, and they need your patience. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for people like Ryan who have devoted so much of their life to things like the topic of ADHD. I pray that the words that Ryan shared on this podcast will resonate with fathers and even mothers who listen to this podcast and help them with their children with ADHD, and even those like myself who don't have children with ADHD. God, I pray that what has been shared today will help us, and I pray that we would take to heart the piece of advice of being receptive to learning. God, give us the wisdom and the insight to know that we don't have it all figured out. Give us the wisdom and the insight to know that there's still plenty left for us to learn, that there's more left for us to learn than we actually know, and that will remain the case throughout the course of our lives. God, give us wisdom to learn so that we can be the fathers that our children need us to be. We ask for your help, and we trust in your resources and your provisions. In Jesus' name, amen. I want you to know that I am so grateful that you're a part of Fathering Our Future, and I'm here for you. I know that the journey of fatherhood is not always easy. There's definitely some ups and there's some downs along the way too. But if you ever need help, I'm here for you. fatheringourfuture@gmail.com is how you can reach out to me. But again, thank you so much for being with me. This is Fathering Our Future. I'm Anthony Vandegrift, and I hope you'll join me next time. Hey, one more time, I want to thank you for listening to Fathering Our Future. If you're not subscribed to the podcast, please do so wherever you listen and consider leaving a nice review because I would appreciate that. But if you're not connected to Fathering Our Future on social media, you can find it on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and there you're going to get some additional content on a more regular basis that you don't always get here on the podcast. Now, the last thing that I would like to ask of you is that you would consider becoming a financial partner of Fathering Our Future, because dads make a difference, and dads are not disposable. Dads are vital, and they are essential, and they are needed. And the impact that dads make doesn't just reside in the home, but it has a ripple effect that goes to churches and communities and culture. And I'm inviting you to be a part of equipping and empowering and educating dads to be the dad that God has called them to be and that their children need them to be. You can become a financial partner with Fathering Our Future. It can be a one-time contribution, a monthly commitment, but by doing that, you play a direct role in impacting dads. You can check the link in the description below. You can pray about it. You can get on board. And I thank you in advance for becoming a part of Fathering Our Future in a special and a dynamic way. God bless you.